Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Heather Isperon, and with me today is Assistant Chief Dee Walker from Montgomery County Police Department. Welcome, Dee.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Great. Today we're going to talk about law enforcement and your experience as you've been on the job for how many years?
Oh gosh, you make me answer that one. 23.
Wow. And being in Montgomery County, you're surrounding the District of Columbia area. And I'm curious about the last 5 years and the evolution, or 6 years really, of Homeland Security and how you've seen the evolution from, just providing law enforcement and public safety to now the whole evolution of Homeland Security and how that's affected your agency.
Well, it's been an interesting period of time, obviously since 2001, and specifically because in 2002 we had the Beltway sniper case. In the Beltway sniper case, we were able to leverage a few of the lessons that we learned after September 11th, 2001, and since that time I think we've leveraged even more. Specifically, I think that immediately post 9/11 there was an expectation that police departments could sort of sit back and have resources thrown at them. Fast forward to 2008, January 2008, and I think we recognize that there's a responsibility to sort of isolate where the resources will do the most good in the big picture, strategically, if you will. So it's not just sort of sitting back and saying, hey, what's the federal government going to give us this year? What's the state government going to do for us this year? It's more of us being part of a regional plan, a regional quilt, if you will, a patchwork, where we isolate how we're going to use the building blocks to enhance the security of not just Montgomery County. Montgomery County is a suburban jurisdiction of Washington, D.C., but also the metropolitan Washington region as a whole. How we can leverage each other's resources, how we can work to make each other stronger. And I think that type of perspective that's based on relationships, it's certainly based on economies of scale. I don't think that perspective existed on September 10th of 2001. So we've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. It's a very expensive business, and a lot of these resources are perishable, especially in terms of training. But there's an awareness of that, again, and I don't think that awareness existed 6 years ago. So we're moving ahead, and I think that that effort is being driven by a handful of folks who have a 30,000-foot view, and they understand not only how our region needs to operate as sort of a team, but also how the region has to fit into sort of the national fabric. So we're getting there. We're getting there.
Right. And over the last 5 years and 6 years, the Homeland Security budgets have been pretty plentiful. And as we move further away from events that are driven that way, do you feel that, as the budgets get tighter and tighter, that you will still maintain those relationships and that quilt work that's going to remain intact? Do you think that will make it stronger going forward?
Well, my hope is that it will, and I think that one of the ways from the police perspective that we do that is engaging more of an all hazards perspective, because we don't have the luxury of focusing on just one thing, because as soon as you focus on one thing, something else happens and you're not ready for it.
Right.
We used to call it a failure of imagination, and now we just call it failure. So my hope is that the relationships won't go away. I think we've all sort of seen the value of that. The resources, it becomes a little bit more tricky because, as I mentioned, it's expensive stuff. And I think after September 11th, there was a lot of throwing money at the problem.
Right.
And with that comes an expectation, almost an entitlement on the part of not just local jurisdictions, but even some disciplines. But we know that the national economy, in the situation that we're facing, there's downward trends. Maryland is facing a tremendous budget deficit that's going to have tremendous impact locally. But I think that there really is a recognition that there are certain fundamental building blocks in our wall of protection at the local level that we can't compromise on. So the kinds of commitments that we've made to staff the Joint Terrorism Task Forces and the Maryland Coordination Analysis Center, those don't go away. Cuts are always painful, but those are not the kinds of cuts that I think we can justify at this point in time. I don't think anybody can. So we have to be pretty careful. And you know, and a lot of people look, I think that a lot of folks are looking at some of the grant programs to sort of tide them over. And I think that's problematic. I think that from a local perspective, it's almost erroneous because it's not the federal government's responsibility to do that. So I think that there's still some work, and each locality kind of handles that a little bit differently. But I think that's very dangerous. So we'll have to work harder to make those more building blocks over the long term and not sort of to tide us over when we can't afford to fund something locally.
Right. So multiple sources are more intelligent long-term solution than just the single source
Absolutely.
funding.
And you look at them as how can you best leverage those resources strategically? What are your focus areas, and how can you leverage those resources to enhance your focus areas? Because each region has different needs, and you want to be able to make sure that while you're addressing regional needs, you're also able to fit into the national picture. Right. So it's a juggling act, and my own sense is, from having talked to people around the country, is a lot of jurisdictions don't quite get that yet, but that's the direction that we're heading.
Right. And so as the discipline of Homeland Security is evolving and looking across the country and looking long term, do you feel that education is now a necessary element of law enforcement and public safety, that you can't just do training anymore? That's not going to solve the problems. Do you have any
I think
thoughts on that?
It's I think for us in policing, it's really a fine line, because depending on where you go in the country, you could be regarded as sort of an education snob, because there are still a lot of people that think that you don't need higher education to be a good police officer. And I think that there's really empirical evidence to show that it's beneficial. It's beneficial, it's cost beneficial, it's personally and professionally beneficial to the individuals. People who have, police officers who have college are statistically less likely to be involved in civil rights violation lawsuits. That's a tremendous benefit to an agency. So if you were to say, let's say that in the coming decade or in the coming 2 decades that Homeland Security becomes sort of that next area, like civil rights has been for us, challenging and very, very important to sort of understand the landscape. Well, there's no way you can understand the landscape if you're not going to engage education. It's one thing to learn about how to recognize a suitcase bomb, or even to understand the technical skills of defusing a bomb. This isn't operational, this is strategic, and that's where the 30,000-foot perspective comes into play. You can't see, as a manager, as a police manager, I want to be able to see not just that I have the resources available to me to defuse the bomb, but what the pebble in the pond effect is in the whole community and in the region. And you can't have that if you're down on the ground. You simply can't have it. So I'm a big fan of education. I just think that it enhances you as an individual. It enhances you on behalf of your agency. It enables you to serve at a higher level. And if our communities aren't demanding that, I almost feel like I should say shame on the community, because you get what you get. And if you demand the best from the officers that serve your jurisdiction, you're going to get a very high quality level of service. So I think it makes a difference. I think it makes a huge difference.
Well, Dee, thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure, thank you.